cloud, and we are recording. And I'm turning off my video to save bandwidth. I'm in a hotel room. So thanks, Derek. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lyon. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for putting this together. I know you're in Poland. It's a long way away, and I appreciate your help with this. I also want to thank my old friend Ben Bowman for introducing me to your group in the first place. I am sitting in Boxford, Massachusetts. It's a small town about 40 minutes north of Boston. And I'm talking tonight about Innovation on Tap, which is my fourth and most recent book. And as Dr. Lyon said, maybe my last. I had written originally, I'd written it for a general audience, but I also wanted to interest entrepreneurs who believe, like I do, that there's a strong connection between knowing a little history and being able to navigate the future. So in a few minutes, I'll do an overview of the book, but we'll also zero in on a couple of stories that serve as kind of miniature case studies in how successful innovation happens. So you get a sense of how the book works for both audiences. For many years, I was CEO of SenseTech. It's a venture-backed business that was acquired by Carrier Corporation. SenseTech monitors the cold chain, which is the supply chain for perishable products. And our customers were food service, biotech, and pharmaceuticals. So Johnson & Johnson and Genentech and Walmart, those kinds of companies. And I am happy to say that SenseTech continues to thrive under Carrier's ownership. As Dr. Lyon said, I have an MBA. I also have this degree in history, and I've always looked for ways to kind of scratch that historical itch. And in 1999, I co-authored a book about King Philip's War. I mention this fact because when the folks at Carrier discovered that I'd written a book, they asked if I would want to write their corporate history, which became a book called Weather Makers to the World, which is the story of Willis Carrier and the invention and growth of modern air conditioning. It won't surprise you that after I worked in the archives in Syracuse for the better part of a year, that Willis and his innovation ended up in my next book. A bit later, Carrier asked me to partner with their VP of Sustainability, and together we wrote Food Foolish, which tied together food waste, hunger, and climate change, and sustainability would become a major theme in my next book as well. So when I had the opportunity to do my own research and writing, I focused on what I knew and loved, which was history, innovation, and entrepreneurship. I happen to be a huge fan of the case study method. It's what I grew up on in business school. And what that means is, and I really believe this, is that you want to load up your brain. I call it filling up your tank with as many examples of entrepreneurial success and failure as possible. You can't possibly remember them all or all the details, but they're up there percolating. And over time, you begin to see patterns. And I do think pattern recognition is the foundation of wisdom. In business, with your children, maybe in your marriage, pattern recognition is a big thing. So when you face the problem that nobody else has faced before, which by definition is what happens to an entrepreneur, then these models and patterns, I think, put you in the best position possible to make a good decision. So, and let me say it a different way, which is what we all really want is a list. I wanted a list for sure. Tell me what to do to be successful. The 5 things before breakfast, the 10 things not to do before lunch. But I do think that filling up your tank is the best way to create a little business wisdom and some good decision making. The downside is it takes a little extra work. The way I decided to bring together a bunch of these interesting stories and mini case studies was to create a virtual barroom. I could invite living entrepreneurs, I could invite dead entrepreneurs, and they could trade stories and joke and poke fun at each other. But kind of like a Greek chorus, only a drunken Greek chorus. And it would be my way of emphasizing the good lessons in each story and stitching things together between chapters. And this device is based on a real experience I had. All the entrepreneurs were living, of course, but one night in Boston that I write about in the preface. So some of you may be thinking, well, this is a bathroom book, right? And it is a bathroom book. It's thematic, it's chronological, and it all works together, but it doesn't mean that you can't skip around and dip into any story that you want at any time and learn something new. So once I had this virtual bar, my next question was, who gets in? Right? If I was going to write about entrepreneurs, I'd better define what one was. And for that, I needed a bouncer. So I turned to Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist who wrote extensively about entrepreneurs and popularized the term creative destruction. He taught at Harvard from 1932 until 1950. And I parked Schumpeter at the door of my virtual bar, and what he was looking for were two things, and only two things. First, did a person bring a novel combination to market? That is, did they combine two or more things that had never been combined before, right? They didn't have to be new. They certainly didn't have to be technology. You could put chocolate and peanut butter together and get a candy bar. You could put wheels on luggage and get through airports more quickly. And then second, whatever the novel combination was, did it disrupt an economic flow? In modern English, then, an entrepreneur launches an innovation and creates new customers where none existed before. And in Schumpeter's world, an entrepreneur is an economic phenomenon, an economic agent. The role of an entrepreneur is to revitalize capitalism in these waves of new customers or waves of creative destruction. It's the issue that the economists had with someone like Henry Ford. Once he sold Model Ts to everyone who could buy a Model T, the only growth he had left were replacement, the 10% cars that were replaced, unless he brought something new to market. So when guests show up at the door of our bar room, Schumpeter doesn't care if they drive a Tesla or where they graduated from, or if they're courageous or extroverted or passionate or smart. He doesn't even care if they're ethical. He certainly hasn't defined innovation narrowly as a tech startup. He's looking for novel combinations that create new customers. Tech, non-tech, startup, large company, government, nonprofit, social, cultural, doesn't matter. And my hope was that by defining entrepreneur in this way, readers would recognize that they don't have to be Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or whoever the entrepreneur du jour was that year. The ability to innovate, at least in America, is open to anyone and everyone. Schumpeter also had a clever way of making the distinction between launching just any old business, another McDonald's franchise, another law firm, a barbershop, some Me Too product, and actually launching a true entrepreneurial business. He said, add successively as many male coaches as you please, you will never get a railway thereby. It's a little clunky, so we might say today, launch as many new taxi companies as you want, you'll never create an Uber. So we've got a bar room, we've got a bouncer, and I can now choose my entrepreneurs. And as I'm making decisions about whom I might want to write about, several themes emerge, these unifying themes. And it's a good way for me to give you a quick overview of the book. So the earliest theme in Innovation on Tap is mechanization, and it's really the basis for the first industrial revolution. If you were a person who could work with cams and gears and levers and ratchets, if you could create a machine that replaced human labor, you had all kinds of possibilities as an entrepreneur. This section features Eli Whitney, a good Connecticut Yankee. He's one of America's first serial entrepreneurs. He's as interesting and controversial a historical character as you will meet. He invents the cotton gin, and those of you who are my age and who watched Saturday morning cartoons will remember that things were rotten in the land of cotton until Whitney made the cotton gin. And then with a factory in New Haven, he becomes a major producer of muskets, of matchlock muskets, and will become known as the father of interchangeable parts. And we will do a mini case study with Whitney in a minute. The other entrepreneur in the book who demonstrates mechanization is Oliver Ames, and he will become the nation's shovel king. The company he founds will produce 2/3 of the shovels in America. And you can visit his shovel collection at Stonehill College, not far from where I live in Easton, Mass. The second theme of Innovation on Tap, which really accelerates after the American Civil War, is mass production. This is mechanization on steroids. We start to see purpose-built machines linked together inside giant factories. The rise of the railroads, the introduction of the telegraph, and we see the growth of things like magazines and advertising, and the creation of a large national market. One of the entrepreneurs in our bar room who illustrates mass production is King Gillette, the inventor of the disposable razor. And we will return to Gillette for our second mini case study in a moment. Also in mass production, of course, I had to feature Willis Carrier. Here he is graduating from Cornell in 1901 with his 6 co-founders in 1915 and as a success near his death in 1950. How does he fit in? Well, in many industries, it's impossible to mass produce without stable and predictable humidity. Tobacco, candy, bakeries, textiles, pharmaceuticals, trying to make gel caps, for example, construction products, and high tech. The cloud would be almost impossible to maintain without modern air conditioning. In fact, one of Carrier's earliest customers was Gillette. which couldn't keep their blades from rusting on the assembly line during humid summers without air conditioning. They don't adopt stainless steel until the mid-20s. So in Innovation on Tap, I tell the story of Willis's first installation of modern air conditioning. It's in a print shop in Brooklyn in 1902. The building still stands. We visited it. The goal was to ensure that Judge, which was a 4-color political humor magazine, could be printed on time every week. Now, in 1902, to print 4 colors, you had to run the paper through the press 4 times, once for each color. And so let's say it's August in Brooklyn, and you run 2 colors in the afternoon, and then you quit for the day. And that night, maybe a thunderstorm rolls through, and the humidity rises or falls, and the paper expands or contracts just a little bit. But when you run the 3rd color the next morning, the color registry is off and everything looks fuzzy, and you have to scrap the whole press run. That's the problem Carrier was trying to solve. It wasn't about temperature. It certainly wasn't about human comfort. People weren't that concerned about in 1900. Air conditioning was born on the factory floor to address a very specific production issue. So one of the lessons in this chapter worth discussing, especially with young entrepreneurs, is the idea that they hear in graduation speeches, that you need to focus on massive problems and that your goal should be to dent the universe. And my feeling is, talk about being sent out into the world petrified on the day after graduation. We've all seen this meme. We're here to put a dent in the universe. Otherwise, why else even be here? And look, there's nothing wrong with thinking big, but it also helps to know a little history. Most big ideas don't start that way. Here's the rest of the quote, right? Start small, think big. Don't worry about too many things at once. Take a handful of simple things to begin with and then progress to more complex ones. What Jobs is really saying, and what Carrier's story suggests, and frankly, what the history of entrepreneurship shows, is that entrepreneurs who dent the universe almost always start by trying to solve a small problem that will make the world better immediately for someone close by. They think small and targeted, and then with success, they build, and they kind of let the universe take care of itself. Willis Carrier focused on getting moisture out of the air in a building in Brooklyn so a magazine could get printed on time. And today he is considered the father of a $140 billion HVAC still growth industry and credited with helping to create the Hollywood summer blockbuster, the American Sunbelt, and making cities like Singapore livable. Also in this section about mass production, I featured John Merrick, who founded one of the largest Black enterprises in America, and Mary Elizabeth Evans, who launched a mechanized candy and hospitality company that was so successful that some of her competitors thought she must be fronting a hidden trust. The third theme of Innovation on Tap is consumerism, and for that I feature the giant of American consumerism, Alfred Sloan, the CEO of General Motors. He helps invent the model year. He offers something called consumer finance. He invests in design thinking long before it was cool, and in long-range R&D. And Sloan writes the must-have management book of his generation. And under his leadership, GM becomes larger than half the countries in the world. The funny thing about Sloan, he was an introvert. They called him Silent Sloan. He had none of the dynamic charisma we expect from our most successful entrepreneurs. And that is another great lesson for young people. Sloan crushed the greatest industrialist of his time, Henry Ford. Sloan could have bankrupted Ford if he wasn't worried about the government coming after him as a monopolist. In fact, when Alfred thought that Henry might actually go under, he encouraged one of his best friends, Walter Chrysler, to launch a competitor. And since we're in a barroom, I make a barroom argument in this chapter about Sloan. I believe he is the most successful entrepreneur in American history. It's not exactly provable, but it's fun to try to make the case. Second giant of consumerism featured in the book is Elizabeth Arden. She was a Canadian immigrant named Florence Nightingale Graham, who moved to New York City in 1908 and built a billion-dollar empire that redefined beauty in America. One of Arden's most successful products was called the Vienna Youth Mask. It was a papier-mâché and tinfoil mask with electricity flowing through it, and it was supposed to remove wrinkles and make someone look younger. Women paid today's equivalent of about $3,600 for 32 treatments. That was in 1937, the depth of the Great Depression. It was a ton of money for a product that you might guess didn't work. It did not reduce wrinkles. Doctors were baffled, scientists were baffled, but customers loved it. And when I talk with young entrepreneurs about this product, The conversation often begins with the question, does your product actually have to work? Which is an interesting discussion on its own. As one of my bosses used to say, anyone can sell a product that works. Your job is to sell a product that doesn't work. But I think the better question for this particular case study turns out to be, what business was Elizabeth Arden really in? That's the first thing they hit you with at business school. And it sounds like a silly question, but it can be quite complicated, and it's important that you answer it right. Maybe her product really did work. Maybe she just wasn't in the get rid of wrinkles business. And that's a fun conversation to explore. The text I usually highlight here is Ted Levitt's Marketing Myopia. If you've never read it, you might take a look. I will also sometimes present the Bain Pyramid of Value, which I find helpful in terms of identifying and thinking through different levels of consumer needs, which inevitably go way beyond functional needs. The reason I emphasize this question, what business are you really in, is that you can have a great innovation, but you can't possibly build a business model and create new customers without first defining what it is your product really does. Not what you think it does, and not what you want it to do, but what your customers are telling you it does. And then there are a dozen products that do something good for people, but probably don't do what the products claim to do. I went through the internet and tried to find a bunch of them. Answering what business you're in is fundamental to your success, and it emphasizes not the quality of your innovation, which is important, but the quality of your business model. And I hit that theme over and over again in the book. Creation of the business model is job number one. So once we get good at mechanization and mass production and consumerism, we get ourselves into all kinds of trouble because we make too much stuff. So the fourth theme of innovation on tap deals with sustainability. And I start this section welcoming into the barroom Stephen Mather, who founded the National Park Service, where you see the fight between sustainability and consumerism unfold over a century. Mather's a fascinating guy in part because he overcame bipolar disorder. What drew him to nature in the first place is that he found he could heal himself, feel better by being outdoors. Also in this fourth section on sustainability, I have sort of a Wizard of Oz moment, when you're watching it on TV and it goes from black and white to color, which means I now move from history to the stories of living entrepreneurs. These are people I met and interviewed. For example, I profile Emily Rochon, who's an environmentalist and an attorney who's worked with Earth Justice and Greenpeace, among others. Her job is to create new sustainable business models. Kate Sincata is the executive director of Saha Global, which brings clean water to places in desperate need like Ghana. Kate wanted to be an astronaut. She went to MIT. She ended up hitching a ride on a vacation project, and it changed her life. She and her partner chose the simplest technology they could find to clean drinking water, and then identified, trained, mentored new local female entrepreneurs, people who could successfully operate these clean water businesses and convince their neighbors to try the water. I also feature Viraj Puri. He is the CEO of Gotham Greens, a pioneer in the field of urban agriculture. Viraj's story involves turning down venture capital that was anxious to fund his growth until he felt he was ready to grow. He's been very successful. And if you want a true Schumpeterian novel combination, put a hydroponic garden on a rooftop in the middle of Manhattan. And then we come to the fifth theme of the book, which is digitization. In this section, I featured Brenna Berman, the former CIO of the city of Chicago. She introduced predictive analytics into city government, for example, using data to point her overworked health inspectors at the restaurants most likely to be in violation of code, or to anticipate where the next outbreak of rats would occur. She's all about how you define and build community in an urban setting. Jean Brownhill was the CEO of Sweeten, built an online community in the residential renovation space. Jean is one of the few Black female entrepreneurs who has raised more than $1 million in venture capital, and she's raised way more than $1 million. Jean has dyslexia. She was very upfront about it. She didn't figure out until high school that she had it, and she talks about the time she had to, she says, rewire her brain to make sense of the world. And one of my favorite scenes in the book is when Jean reads a biography of Warren Buffett and is so excited that she sends him a letter, and he writes back to her. And it's a turning point in her business life. And I also highlight Jason Jacobs, who built his passion for running into one of the Apple Store's first 200 apps, Runkeeper, and it formed a booming online community of runners. And then the sixth and final theme, which gets woven in throughout the book, features these characters I call social and cultural entrepreneurs. Thomas Downing is one. He's a Black entrepreneur who around 1820 launches the first oyster house in New York City where men and women are allowed to dine together. It's a simple but norm-busting innovation. He ends up attracting the power brokers of Wall Street who cut deals upstairs in the restaurant while Downing is running a stop on the Underground Railroad downstairs in the oyster cellar. Buddy Bolden, King Bolden, was a masterful cornet player from New Orleans who may have been the first American to play something that one day will be called jazz. One of the interesting mini case studies in this chapter is to compare New Orleans in 1900 as an innovation community with Detroit in 1920 and Silicon Valley in 2000. They all worked in very similar ways, one with musical notes, one with clutches and carburetors, and one with software code. And then Branch Rickey, who with Jackie Robinson will change the face of baseball in America. I focus in this chapter on motivation. Did Rickey sign the first Black baseball player in the major leagues because Rickey was an ethical, moral Christian doing the right thing, as he sometimes told people? Or because he was a brilliant general manager who wanted to sell tickets and win the World Series, as he told people at other times? And if we win, if society wins anyway, do we care? That's a good study to talk through because it has implications for today's climate investments, for example, and talks about what happens when doing good and doing well suddenly collide. Okay, so that's the book and some of the key people I highlight. There are 24 entrepreneurs in all, 24 that can get by my bouncer, Schumpeter. They're different, but you'll see patterns, and that's really what we're going for in the book. Okay, so a couple of quick case studies. Eli Whitney, New England farm boy who's educated in Greek and rhetoric at Yale, nothing to do with mechanical stuff. And upon graduation, he accepts a tutoring job at a plantation on the Savannah River. The job falls through, so he comes to stay with friends at Mulberry Grove Plantation to try to figure out what he's going to do with his life. And by the way, before arriving in Savannah, he's never seen a cotton plant in his life. But about a week after hearing about the problems that Southern planters have with ginning cotton, he builds a machine and solves a problem that has been unsolvable for a century. And the question is, how did he do it? This question really bugs historians. There was a book written as recently as 2016 challenging Whitney's claim to the invention. I am kind of an Occam's razor guy. There was no cotton gin. Whitney arrived, there was a cotton gin. And I propose several possible explanations in the book. Let me focus on just one for a second. This article was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2017, and it begins, imagine this. You're the owner of an office building and your tenants are complaining about the elevator. It's old and slow and they have to wait a lot. Several tenants are threatening to break their leases if you don't fix the problem. When asked, most people quickly identify some solutions. You replace the lift, install a stronger motor, maybe you upgrade the algorithm that runs the lift. So the first framing of the question is inevitably, how do I make the elevator run more quickly or more efficiently? And we are paid as managers to be proactive and to solve problems quickly and efficiently. But what the managers of the building did was put mirrors up next to the elevator and complaints plummeted. It turns out that people love to look at themselves in the mirror. The problem that the managers ended up solving was, how do I improve the elevator experience? And if we all sat as a group, we might soon come up with another possibility. How do I shave peak demand? And I'm guessing that there are other ways to frame this problem. It turns out that it's kind of fun before you rush into solving a problem to try to reframe it first in ways that make for a cheaper or a more elegant or more efficient solution. So here's the problem that Whitney heard when he first arrived in Georgia. How do I separate green seeds from short staple cotton? This was the bottleneck for the most important industry in the world. I was about as clueless about cotton as Eli Whitney, so I had a business trip to Arizona while I was doing research for the book, and I snuck off to find a cotton field. And I had a try at separating the green seeds from the cotton staple, and it's not easy, right? A rule of thumb in Whitney's time was that one person could produce 1 pound of clean cotton a day. And people who understood the textile business in 1793 knew that work on the cotton boll had to be done carefully to preserve the staple, because the longer and more intact the staple, the easier it was for the mills in England and New England to weave strong, smooth thread. Long staple varieties like Sea Island and Egyptian or Pima were most valuable. But the advantage of American green seed, short staple cotton was that it could be grown anywhere. It had a 200-day growing season, and that meant from Virginia to California. It was hardy, it was bug resistant, it was the cash crop that the United States, southern states desperately needed. Eli Whitney was pretty ignorant of these issues, which ironically gave him a huge advantage. Instead of asking, how do I separate green seeds from short staple cotton? My hypothesis is he asked, how do I separate short staple cotton from green seeds? This reframing of the question sounds silly, but it changed the United States of America. It allowed Whitney to grab or trap the seeds in a grate and then spin some wire teeth through the staple. It just ripped the living daylights out of the cotton. I don't know if you've seen one, but it's sort of seen one work, but it's sort of like popcorn popping up into the air. And then the seeds slide down into a bin at the bottom of the machine. Nobody who knew anything about cotton or textile manufacture could have possibly dreamed up this contraption. The first machine Whitney built, though, allowed one person to gin 50 pounds of clean cotton a day. And in 1793, a 50 times improvement in productivity was a miracle. And once the machines got bigger and they got hooked up to water or horses or eventually steam, they produced so much clean cotton so quickly, made so much money for the textile industry, that manufacturers downstream would soon adjust to what was once perceived as inferior quality raw material. And short staple cotton became standard. When I started the research on Whitney, if I had run over a cotton gin in my driveway, I would not know what I hit. So I visited Slater Mill, which is in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, not too far away, and watched a two-person, second-generation Whitney cotton gin in action. Whitney is buried at the Grove Street Cemetery at Yale, which is beautiful and historic, worth visiting if you happen to be in the area. And about 2 miles from Yale is a small museum at the site of Whitney's historic armory along the Mill River. So along with knowing what business you're really in, and not worrying about whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, and maybe thinking small and immediate as the best way to eventually dent the universe, I would add to your takeaways before you rush in and try to solve a problem. Spend a little bit of time seeing if there is a way to redefine the problem so that the solution is simpler, cheaper, or more effective. Okay, mini case study 2. This is King Gillette. He's a traveling salesman for Crown Cork and Seal, which is a company that made disposable bottle stoppers and bottle caps. Gillette is a terrific salesman, but he's also an amateur inventor. And one day his boss challenges him to make a disposable product, something like a bottle cap that is meant to be used and thrown away. And in the summer of 1895, Gillette is shaving at his home. He's in Boston, using one of those old, heavy, forged, dangerous, straight-edged razors. They had to be professionally sharpened. They were hard to use, and many men, if they had a little extra cash, would visit the barber shop instead. So Gillette is staring out the window from his Boston home, and he has a vision. At least this is his story. And not long after that, he designs and patents a thin steel shaving blade and a handle that locks it down. The problem is this: he can't find anyone who thinks the product can be built. Everywhere he goes, he's met with skepticism. Now, as you might imagine, King Gillette's network is made up of bottlers, one of whom happens to be Edward Stewart. Stewart can't be helpful, but he approaches his neighbor, Henry Sachs, who makes lamps. He's a Boston lamp maker. And Sachs takes this idea to a friend, whose name is William Emery Nickerson. He's an MIT grad, turns out to be, in my opinion, a genius. Nickerson is interested. He's had several failed businesses. So he meets Gillette, and one of the most successful partnerships of the 20th century is formed. And by 1918, Gillette is making 22 miles of razor blade edges a day. So when I meet with young entrepreneurs, I say, let's just take a minute and think about what happened. Let's say that the gray circle is Gillette's bottling network, and this is his friend, Edward Stewart. Gillette's network and my network and your network are made up of what are called strong links. That is friends, colleagues, suppliers, customers we know well. Our network of strong links is critical to our success. But the downside is that within that network, we tend to know all the same people and share much of the same information. So Gillette tries for 5 years within his strong network and can't find the partner he needs. The purple is Henry Sachs' network of strong links, all about lamp making and lamp selling. And Nickerson happens to be in that network. The only way we can get Nickerson to Gillette is if Stewart takes a walk next door to visit his neighbor Sachs. In network theory, this is called a weak link. It's obvious the role that strong links play in our success, but now you can visually see the crucial role that weak links play in networking. It's a walk next door. It's an uncomfortable call to someone you don't really know. But the payoff to risking a weak link is accessing another strong network. It changed King Gillette's life, and it changed the history of America. In a world of smartphones and texting, where a lot of young entrepreneurs have had to live through COVID early in their careers, it's really intimidating for young people to access weak links. But it's the way you get jobs, it's the way you find partners, it's the way you get financed, and the way you can really build strong community. The final essay in the book, the last case study, is The Creation of Hamilton, and it talks about innovation, Schumpeter's novel combinations, in ways that non-technical people immediately understand. For example, Thomas Jefferson is born in 1743. Rap music is born in the 1980s. Neither is especially new, but combine them and something magical occurs. A brand new audience is created that never cared about theater or maybe about American history, and they're suddenly flocking to Broadway. You might recall the reviews for Hamilton were stunning. The New York Times review started, "Yes, it really is that good." The payback to investors was also stunning. They put up about $12.5 million, and the show will gross $1 billion in its first decade. But what I want you to think about is this. After opening night, after the flowers and the reviews, all the praise for how innovative they were, the cast of Hamilton had to get up the next day and do it again, and again, and again, and again. Tomorrow night, it's President and Mrs. Obama. The next night, it's Stephen Sondheim. The weekend is the UN General Council. Every day, every night has to be your best performance ever. It's part of entrepreneurship that sometimes gets lost in the conversation that focuses so much on innovation. Because once you innovate, you have to operate. I think of it in terms of an Egg McMuffin, which was a true innovation in 1972. It launched the entire breakfast segment of fast food. Before the McMuffin, you may recall, fast food restaurants were dark until about 11 a.m. We didn't even know that we could eat and drive at the same time. But what makes the Egg McMuffin successful? It's the fact that McDonald's has been able to train thousands and thousands of unskilled workers for years and years in every country to make it the same way every single time, every single day. The last thing you want at 7 a.m. in the morning is some enthusiastic 18-year-old entrepreneur deciding they want to innovate your breakfast. My belief is, and it's cost a lot of entrepreneurial CEOs their jobs, is that we put way too much emphasis on the first part of Schumpeter's equation, the novel combination, and not nearly enough on disrupting the market. Kurt Vonnegut said, another flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. Peter Drucker had a little more constructive analogy. He says, entrepreneurship and management are like the bow hand and the finger hand of a violin. They do very different things, but if you don't have both, you don't get any music. What this really says is that in order to be successful through a launch, a scale up, and rapid growth, your skill set or the skill set of your surrounding community needs to evolve. There's a famous article by Noah Wasserman in the February 28, 2008 edition of the HBR. His figures are pretty stark. 50% of founders are no longer CEO by year 3. Most don't leave by choice. What happens, though, is that someone who might never invent an Egg McMuffin can build a team to make millions of them flawlessly. And in the process, they make everyone rich. In other words, the second person in often builds on the work of the founder and cashes everyone out. So the question Wasserman asks the reader is, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king? If you can do both, great. Some people can. But if you can't, you may end up destroying value. What's important is that you do a little thinking about that answer before you have to face the question. I was listening to a podcast the other day with Jason Alexander, and he said he signed a 14-month contract for a Broadway show. It's like, that's the dream of every actor. Steady work, steady paycheck, fame on the biggest stage of America. And Alexander said that by the 6th month, he knew he wasn't going to make it. He couldn't stand delivering the same lines over and over and over again. But there are people who can do that, who can make or deliver the same product over and over flawlessly and get other people to do it. It's something important to think about as you build your business. So from my point of view, I believe that knowing history is a competitive advantage, and you do that by constantly filling your tank. You want as many examples of success and failure in your brain as you can possibly stuff. Second, community is an entrepreneur superpower. We talked a little about it in Gillette. I hit it hard on the chapter in Hamilton, but none of the entrepreneurs in this book would have been successful without their communities. And by community, I don't mean networking, which is important, Networking is a skill, but community is kind of a lifetime value, something that can be practiced every day. It means being open to the person who calls you out of the blue and just wants to talk. It means reaching out to the person who you've worked with for years and don't really know. 20 years later, having that person as part of your community can change your life. Creation of the business model is job number one. It's not about dreaming up inventions. It's not about filing patents. They're good stuff, but it's about creating customers. Your fate will rise and fall on the quality of your business model. Don't fall for the dominant narrative, right? In every generation, there's always an entrepreneur du jour. Jack Welch is the guy we all wanted to be not long ago. We loved him, now we don't love him. Elizabeth Holmes, Sam Bankman-Fried, Elon Musk. We all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. If you construct a community that complements your skills, you can just be yourself. And then you need to know what business you're really in. It may not be the one you think you're in or the one you want to be in. You want to solve the problem at hand and let the universe take care of itself. Before you rush in to solve a problem, you may be able to find a better question. And your strong links are comfortable and important, but learn to exploit your weak links. So that's Innovation on Tap. It's chronological, it's thematic, it's fun, it's a bathroom book if you like. It's a book full of case studies designed not just to entertain, but to help you fill up your tank and get smart. As the title suggests, it goes well with a beer. These are 3 of the alternative covers that the publisher's designer prepared for me. I worried that someone would think I was writing a history of beer between the title and the cover, so I stayed away from the tap and tavern themes. But now that you know the book better, you may embrace those themes as you read. The book is available in hardcover, e-reader, and audio. I had a lot of fun writing it. I keep a blog, The Occasional CEO, where I offer some free resources related to the book. And I just want to thank you again for your time and interest, and I'll now turn things back to Doug.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much. I appreciated the presentation. I think everybody else did too. Are there any questions in the audience? Please remember to unmute yourself if you want to chime in with a question. I haven't been monitoring the chats.
Yeah, Eric, I have a question. This is Bill, and wonder if your thoughts on in the process of going through innovation, just like as you described. I imagine that a lot of the people that you wrote about had ups and downs and times when folks said, "Nah, you should get out of that," or dark days. What are your thoughts about that? Are the entrepreneurs? Is there a pattern with regards to the ups and downs that they led in their career?
Yeah, good question. I think that there's several of them. Like Eli Whitney had a nervous breakdown. There are others who really suffered during this process. I suppose it's part of the human condition, and it happens to lawyers and accountants and custodians as well. But the pressure that people put on themselves to succeed as entrepreneurs is pretty high. I do think that you have to be careful. You will hear from time to time that the hallmark of an entrepreneur is grit, perseverance and grit. And clearly it's a good quality to have, unless you have a lousy business model or an innovation that's not working in the market. And then grit will send you into a tailspin. So it's like every other quality. Be a little careful when you hear someone say the hallmark of every successful entrepreneur is grit, because the hallmark of many unsuccessful entrepreneurs is also grit. You got to be a little bit careful. But I do think that the stronger the community, the healthier folks tended to be. So building up that community over time can be a real advantage to people.
So I noticed you may have mentioned that Eli Whitney was making matchlocks, but of course he was making flintlocks, not matchlocks. Matchlocks are way
Flintlocks,
before
exactly. No,
flintlocks.
absolutely right. Flintlocks. Yeah, that's right. So Whitney gets himself into trouble. He didn't make any money really from the cotton gin, because he offered it for sale, and then he had a fire in New Haven and snowstorms and yellow fever and so forth, and he couldn't deliver to the market. So it wasn't, once you knew how it worked, you could build your own, and a lot of people did. And he ran around in litigation all throughout the South for about 10 years. Meanwhile, he finds out that the government, the Springfield Armory and the United States government need muskets desperately. So he decides he's in the musket business. And of course, the holy grail of the Industrial Revolution was interchangeable parts. So he implies that he's conquered this question of interchangeable parts. A musket was probably the hardest thing to manufacture in the 18th century America. It was the lock, the stock, the barrel. The parts were very difficult to make one after another. They had to survive percussive shock. So Whitney gets himself into a second jam. He runs out of money, and he's got a contract to deliver 10,000 in 2 years, and he delivers 500 in the first year. So he goes to Washington with a bunch of locks, which are the sophisticated part of the flintlock, and he meets with Jefferson and Adams, because Jefferson's incoming, Adams is outgoing, Secretary of War, and probably a local congressman and senator. And he puts them throws all the pieces on the table, and he says, gentlemen, combine these in any order that you like. They will all work. I don't know whether he said he conquered interchangeable parts or not, but they are so impressed that they give him another advance of $10,000, and off he goes. It saves his company. It saves his reputation. Okay, so now he's the father of interchangeable parts. In about 1960, one of the historians from MIT goes to, I think, the Connecticut Historical Society and asks if he can look at the locks that Whitney has, that they have of Whitney's. And he takes them apart and he finds that they've all been hand filed and carefully made so that those particular locks would match. But he was nowhere near having conquered interchangeable parts. So, like Steve Jobs showing that the famous iPhone demonstration 2008, when the iPhone didn't actually work, but they hardwired it all together so it worked. The question that we quite often ask entrepreneurs is it ever okay to lie? And that can take 2 or 3 classes to get through if you're actually with young people, because the quick answer is no, it's never okay to lie. But if you thought the product were going to be fixed in 3 months, could you say today that it works? Is that okay? And you start to go down sort of some of these interesting paths. But Whitney is like an entire textbook in entrepreneurship between the cotton gin and the musket.
I'm fond of saying that the difference between a con man and an entrepreneur is that the entrepreneur actually believes what he's telling you.
Right. So if you believe it, it's not a lie, right?
You're right. You could say there's enormous potential in this new drug, but if you tell me, okay, this is going to get rid of all your wrinkles, and you know it won't, right, that's a different story. Now you're being a bit of a con man. But that doesn't mean you can't be successful as an entrepreneur.
Right. I had a lawyer friend who used what he called the purple principle. If he could say it and not turn purple, then he would say it.
Wow, that's cool. Are there any other questions?
I do have one other question. I hope I'm not over dominating the question part, but Eric, you mentioned about community being important, and historically, the way we have community today is a little bit different. And I've been reading articles, I'm sure all of you know, about the hybrid work model, and even today, right now, we're having a meeting virtually. And there's some differences when you're meeting virtually as opposed to literally in a bar or in some office. We're not having those true connections so close. Is that a disadvantage for entrepreneurs now compared to what it was before, or do you think it's even more of an advantage for us because we have the ability to reach so far with the technology? Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Again, I think that we live at the beginning of COVID when we all switched to virtual, and it seemed pretty successful. We were living off this built-up equity that we'd all sort of banked because we'd been working with those people for 10 or 20 or 30 years. We knew them. We knew the names of their kids. And as you know, so for example, when you try to transfer technology, there's the charts and diagrams to do it, but there's also all the soft knowledge of how things really work and how you tie this a special way or do this a special way that doesn't get transferred unless you are face to face with somebody. So I think my feeling is that the older, those of us who are older who bank that equity can do pretty well with people who were in our network before we went to all this virtual. But if you're coming out of school and I mean, one of my children went to school, lived with, I think, 6 other people in an apartment, and they had a major crisis about, well, I don't know what it was, cleaning or towels or something. And they solved it by texting to each other. Right. And I thought, well, that's going to be a problem when they get into the workforce, asking someone on a date, asking someone to go to have a coffee with you are all skills that most of us who are a little bit older learn that may be lacking in the new generation. And Bill, I think your question is a good one. It's going to have to come back somehow. You're going to have that face-to-face, real touch in order to establish the kind of relationships that you want to be successful. I don't know how you feel. Do you feel the same way?
Well, my experience as a person has a career in a different field and trying to break into entrepreneurship and speaking with a variety of folks is I don't speak with anybody in person. It's all either virtual, and I enjoy the contacts of I work with people all the time in my business, and I enjoyed that benefit. And I think there is a lot to the communication of just sitting next to someone. And I think a lot of it's lost with the technology. But I do have the ability of using things like AI, recently, which I think has been amazing in my research and things that I can do with my bootstrap approach to my business. So I'm kind of thinking I'm old, where I had a significant amount of career before, internet and cell phones, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of torn, is it good or bad for me? But I was just curious what your thoughts were. Are we going to have more successful entrepreneurs? Are we going to have a different type of entrepreneur, going forward?
Yep. I understand. I think you're right. If you can work the hybrid, there are times when you must, and you need to know what those times are, when you must be face to face, and other times when it's just more efficient to be on a Zoom or something. I will tell you this about book selling, just so you know. If I did a book talk, let's say 30 people showed up, I might sell 20 books. If I could do, and I can do a book talk with 300 people on Zoom and sell 2 books. So the human factor of that, in at least that regard, is very powerful.
Yeah, I went to a meet and greet in New Haven maybe a year ago, and I told my kids about the experience, and they're all in their 20s, and I said I went there. I said my plan to this meet and greet, and I didn't know anybody there, so I'm going to go and get a beer. I'm going to get some food, and then afterwards, I'm going to talk to as many people as I can at the meeting, and anybody who is not talking to somebody, I'm going to go up to them and just make a contact. And they thought I was crazy. They couldn't believe that's what networking is. They just, like you said, they'd rather text. they don't have it's just so scary for them to just go up to people and how you doing, what do you do, this is what I do, and I walked away from that meeting having 2 connections that were great. It really moved me a little bit forward. So I thought that was a useful tool, and I try to talk to them about networking, but it's hard, I think, with this generation to do it, and maybe even to see the importance of it.
Right. Agreed.
Well, I don't know if there are any other questions, but if there aren't, I'd like you all to join us on the 25th of June, where we'll have Michael Invernali come in as an SBIR STTR consultant and help us with our funding from such places as the NSF and the DOE and that sort of thing. And I hope you'll all join me in thanking Eric for a great presentation. Eric, thank you very much. I'm giving you the virtual clap. I don't know if others can do that.
It was my pleasure. Thanks.
Sure thing.
Thanks,
Have
Eric.
a good evening, everybody.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.